Greetings, and welcome back to another episode of Joy in the Morning podcast, where we have real conversations about life and faith. I'm your host, Joy Richard, and I'm very grateful, very thankful that you decided to tune in for another episode. If this is your first time, welcome. If this is not your first time, welcome back. I'm glad that you decided to tune in and been on the journey with these conversations that we have here on Joy in the Morning. Honestly, I am truly blessed that I get to do this, and I just get to share and have different conversations with people here. So I'm just beaming with gratitude, I guess you could say, over the last couple of weeks. Whenever I think about the podcast or I'm doing episodes for the podcast, there's just this gratitude that comes over me, and still just a little bit of shock because I genuinely cannot believe that I'm doing this. I would have never dreamed in like 100 years that I'd be doing a podcast, but here I am. So thank you, everyone who's been on the journey. It is such a blessing. As we get ready to jump into today's episode, it's not a long one, but it is something that we've talked about a couple times here on the podcast, really about like what it really means to follow Christ and what that looks like, and how it's just this really clear decision between what we want versus what Christ wants for us. So, again, it won't be a long episode, but it is something I felt compelled to talk about, and I draw from a passage that I've used previously in another episode. So I hope you enjoy. Short, sweet, and to the point. Let's get into it. Let's go ahead and get into today's topic and into today's episode. And today we'll be talking about something that I've referenced in a previous episode, which is this passage from Matthew 16 that I'll read in a bit, that talks about if anyone wants to come after me, they need to take up their cross, deny themselves, and follow me. And it seems like such a big statement. Well, not seems like, I guess you could say it is such a big statement. The more I thought about it and the more I've kind of like really started, I guess you could say, to live this out or realized what it means to live this out, it's been rather interesting because I find it a little contrary to the idea that most of us have in our heads when we decide to follow Jesus. I think there's this huge like excitement factor and celebration factor, which is valid and necessary, right? It's like when you encounter Jesus and you find this peace and you realize he died for you and like he's the savior of the world and all these things, like it is honestly such a blessing. Like there's not any other way to respond other than like joy and excitement and celebration and really gratefulness and thankfulness, right? But then there's also, as you begin to live your life according to the beliefs and the teachings of Jesus, and as you really begin to devote yourself to being a believer in Jesus Christ, there's this second idea and there's this new nature being born in you. And there's this realization that you start to have where there may be things that you want to do or that you used to enjoy that sometimes just not as exciting anymore, but sometimes there begins to be this tension, this conflict within you, because it's like things that you used to do that you had no problem doing, you didn't feel bad about it, it was totally fine. You start to feel like this tension around it, and you start to feel kind of weird about it, for lack of a better word, where you're like, oh man, like there's a conviction in you where there wasn't before, and you start to realize like, oh man, like I like doing this thing. I don't know why I feel weird doing it now when I did it before and there was no problem. But now there's this thing in you where you're like, I don't know if I enjoy this the way I used to. I don't know if I can keep doing what I used to do. And it's just the beginning of this new nature being born in you, but also it's the beginning of this point of making decisions where you have to choose, am I going to live life my way and continue to do the things that really like feed my flesh, or continue to do things that just like make me feel good and they satisfy me? Or are you going to live your life in a way that's like pleasing to God? And when you feel these discrepancies inside of you, these tensions and these convictions, are you going to live according to those convictions, or are you going to brush it off and just continue to do what you've always done and what you enjoy? And it can be difficult, I think, to start to like sort through that and to decipher those things. And I think a lot of times, a lot of what we've heard, and a lot of times, like, the idea is just like, okay, like, I've accepted Jesus into my heart, and I accept that he's my Lord and Savior, but we still have this idea and our own plans for our lives, and we don't always consider like what Jesus wants for us and how he wants us to live. And before I get to this verse in Matthew, I'm reminded of a verse in Proverbs that talks about how a man plans his way, but the Lord orders his steps. And it's like we all have this plan for our life and the things that we like to do and the things that we want to do and where we see ourselves going and the things that we think we're meant for. But then as the more you follow Jesus, sometimes like those plans kind of go out the window. And it's not always like, okay, like now you can't do this, and this because you follow Jesus. A lot of times it's not about what you can't do. It's about what you're now free to do now that you're not living out of pain and hurt and rejection. And now that you're not just constantly operating out of a place of fear and anxiety, it's like you have so much more freedom to be who God has designed you to be because you're operating out of peace, you're operating out of joy, you're operating out of all these blessings, and you're operating out of who you are really meant to be and who Christ has made you to be. And so that changes your whole perspective and your whole worldview and how you make decisions. And also there's this sense of accountability that like my life is no longer just my own. It now belongs to Christ. And so instead of just doing things that feed us and our flesh and our satisfaction and our own selfish desires, we have a higher sense of accountability and responsibility to live our lives the way that Jesus has called us to. And so we can make plans to say, okay, like I'm going to do this because I think this is what God wants me to do. And we go down these different paths. And then there sometimes comes a point where Jesus is like, no, that's not what I have for you. And it can be challenging because we've already made up in our minds, right? And we've already made this plan, but the Lord has ordered our steps. And in Matthew 16, it talks about 16, I think this is verse 24. Jesus, he's talking to his disciples and he said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Verse 25, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whosoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And so it's very interesting phrasing. And this is happening after he starts explaining to his disciples that his time on earth is short and that his death is near. And as he's talking to his disciples about like his purpose really of like why he's here on earth and what's going to happen to him, Peter, who if you know anything of the Bible, he's a pretty fiery guy. He's very, very passionate is the best way to describe him. Like one minute he's really angry, just really passionate about different things. And so as Jesus is telling them, the disciples, about like, you know, his death and resurrection, Peter kind of like pulls Jesus to the side and he's telling him, like, rebuking him essentially, like, why would you say this? This is not going to happen to you. And Jesus like tells Peter like straight up, like just to his face, like, Satan, get behind me. You're a hindrance to me. And it's really interesting because like in the passage before this, also in chapter 16, Jesus tells Peter, like, you know, on this rock, like you, on this rock, I'm going to build my church, and is commending him for having this revelation of who Jesus is. Then in the next verse, even though Peter has had this revelation and he's like, you know, in his mind, he knows, based on this revelation of who he knows Jesus to be, he has this idea and this mindset and this plan of how his life with Jesus is going to go. And I mean, he's in relationship with Jesus. They've been friends and walking together for 3 years. And then Jesus starts saying these things, and Peter is like, oh, no. That's not it. Like, that's not what's going to be. And Jesus tells him, like, you're a hindrance to me. Then he starts to explain, And he's like, if anyone wants to come after me, if anyone wants, to live as I have lived and to continue my legacy, essentially, like, and to follow me, like, you need to take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And it's really interesting because it may not be the response you expect. So, like, first he tells Peter, like, you're a hindrance, get behind me. But then, like, he graciously kind of goes on to explain, like, what is required to be all in on Jesus's life, to be all in your faith, to be all in and, like, continuing to follow him. And technically, Peter is already all in, right? He's followed him for 3 years. He's gone where Jesus has gone. He's seen these miracles. And, like, it can be like that for us in our faith. Like, we've been following Jesus for a long time. We have these revelations of who he is, and we think we know what he's about. And then he starts speaking to us about more things that are to come. And then we're like, oh, Jesus, I don't know if that's you, because it just doesn't line up maybe 100% with what we're expecting, right? And Peter was not expecting for Jesus to die. Peter was not expecting for what was going to happen. Like, Peter had his own idea, but Jesus needed him to know, like, you have to deny yourself. And to follow me, you have to deny your own mindset. You have to deny your own ideas and your own plans. And you have to follow me, and you have to follow my direction, and you have to follow my leading, and you have to follow my prompting, and you have to follow in my legacy and in my teachings. It's not just about what you want. It's not just about what you've seen over these 3 years, but really it's about being obedient and fashioning your life after mine, is essentially what Jesus is saying. And he goes on again in verse 25 to say, for if anyone wants to save his life, he should lose it. And that's an extreme statement. It's like, okay, if you want to save your life and continue to live how you're living, you've got to lose your life. You've got to walk away from the things that you've held on to and who you've expected yourself to be. But if anyone wants to find his life, he needs to lose it for my sake. So he's bringing this idea to his disciples that, like, to really find life and to live it the way that I have called you to live, you need to lose your life. And I think that really means just, like, lose this idea that you've had of how you're going to live and what things are going to be like, and follow me and follow my teachings and follow my word. And a lot of times I think we have this idea of, like, Jesus and whatever I want to do, and Jesus plus, the things that make me comfortable. But the idea is actually lose it, lose all of that, and only hold on to what I'm showing you, only hold on to what I'm teaching you, only hold on to how I'm leading you and guiding you. And that is what's going to propel you forward. And then he goes on to say, like, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? And that reminds me of Solomon in Ecclesiastes, right? Solomon talks about how he has given his life to wisdom. He's given his life to become wise, and he's given himself to all these different life experiences, and he's made the most money, and he's been with the most women, and he's had all these different life experiences, and he's gained all these different things in life. And at the end of all these different phases of his life, he just says it's all meaningless. It all means nothing. And it's so easy to lose yourself when you're going after something that you think you've really wanted, and then you realize, oh, this is not what I thought it would be. And I think that speaks more to, like, what Jesus is asking of the disciples and what he's asking of us, which is to lose our idea of life and to realize that, like, if your whole goal is to gain different things in this world, if it's to gain popularity and fame, if it's to gain just more material things or more life experiences, like, what is that going to cost you? It makes you have to think about the cost and realize, like, if you do that, you'll lose your soul. But the only way to truly find life and to have it and to live in a way that's peaceful and joyful and full of blessing is to lose yourself in Christ and to lose yourself for Christ, and to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught up in the things of this world, and to really focus on the things of heaven. And to not be so caught in what the world is doing and to not be so caught up in your own selfish desires and what you want. And even sometimes our idea of Jesus, we're so clinging on to what we think about Jesus or how we think he should be, just like Peter did. Like, he thought Jesus should function in a certain way and that Jesus' future was going to be a certain way, and it wasn't. And Jesus tells him, like, deny yourself, deny your own thoughts and beliefs about what you think I'm going to do. And like, cling to what I'm teaching you, and know that that is the truth and that is what I have for you. And like, a lot of times that's hard because, again, we start out and we're full of this excitement, but then we have to realize, like, it's not just about what we think our life is going to look like after we've received Christ, but it's whatever Christ has for us. That's our life now. It's whatever he speaks and however he leads and however he guides, and not being so married to our idea and our interpretation of it that then we lose sight of who he really is and what he's really doing. And the more that he reveals his plans and purposes, the more we have to let go of our plans and purposes for our life. And really, when it comes down to it, if we think about it, like, and it's not even just like if we think about it, like, we can go back and look at, our patterns of when we've been following Christ. It's like his way is always better than our way. Like, as Jesus leads and guides us, his way is totally better. And it's not so full of these ups and downs of, like, how it is when we are leading ourselves. There's so many ups and downs and so many mistakes. And a lot of times, if you've been living for any amount of time, as we all have, we all know that, like, even when we plan things, nothing ever goes as planned, ever. Life happens, mistakes happen, people come into our lives, and everything changes. And so it's not about the plans that we make for ourselves, but it's about the plans that Jesus has for us, and us continually submitting and accepting those plans and walking into those things and saying yes every step of the way, and being willing to lay down and lay aside what we thought things were going to look like and how we plan to live out our belief in Jesus, and not trying to still have our own way and accomplish God's way, but really just consistently and continually submitting to him and accepting him. I'm reminded of another verse in Matthew, and it talks about how the path of life is narrow. To give a little context to this verse before I talk about what it reminds me of and really get into it, here in Matthew 7, where it talks about the narrow way, it really is just where Jesus is giving these really clear, like, thoughts and really clear ways and, like, how we should live as Christians. And this passage in particular is talking about salvation, how, like, the way is wide that leads to just, like, worldly living, but, like, the way is narrow that leads to living a life for Christ and really being saved. And so that's kind of like the context of this verse. What reminds me of this verse is a few things. Firstly, like, giving up your own way and giving up your own opinion and your plans is hard. And in this verse, it references that. And so I'm just going to read this here and we'll talk through it. But it's Matthew 7, verses 13 through 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. Those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. Again, it reminds me of what we were just talking about in Matthew 16, because it's very hard, to give up your own way. But few people are usually ever willing to fully, truly devote themselves to something and to remove themselves completely and give themselves to whatever it is that they're believing in. And, like, whether you are a Christian or not, whether you want to be a Christian or not, like, if whatever you've devoted your life to and really believe in, that you're like giving your life to it, it does require what it talks about in Matthew 16, which is like denying yourself. It's really just like a biblical principle. When we look at people that are immensely skilled in like basketball, sports, or musicianship, right? They've given their lives and devoted themselves to practicing and playing music or playing sports or whatever it is. And they apply themselves to all these different things that are going to make them a better or more skilled like musician, make them a better or more skilled sportsman, make them a better or more skilled business person. And they'll follow whatever they need to follow to become the best in this thing. And it's hard. First of all, like it's hard. It's hard to really devote yourself in a way that like it's like you breathe, eat, and sleep this thing. But Jesus really is asking that same thing of us to following him. And it says that way is hard. And those who find it are few. Those that really devote themselves and take that hard way are few. Because the way is easy to just do what feels good, but it's a way that leads to destruction. The gate is wide and the way is easy. And it's like whenever you get into doing something, and it's easy, it's always kind of like raise a little bit of a red flag, right? You're like, oh, I don't know, this seems a little bit too easy. It can't be, we get a little skeptical and we're like, oh, this is too easy. I don't know if this is right. Like that's a natural inclination, right? And Jesus is pretty much saying like the easy way leads to destruction as far as life goes. But the path to life, few will find it. It's a hard path. It's a hard way to walking by faith. It can be exciting at times, but it can also be difficult to live totally according to faith and just trust and believe in what Jesus is saying and how he's leading and guiding you, and to live according to the Bible, especially now, like in this society. So many of Jesus's teachings and in his way that he's called us to live is kind of countercultural to what we see happening right now in the world. Like he's called us to live in unity, but there's so much division, right? He commands us that as long as it's up to you to live peaceably among all men. But like the message of peace is not constantly being preached. Like being selfless is not being preached. It's not being taught widely. Like the way that we're taught to live is like in ways of division. You only really get close and associate with people that believe like you believe and that want what you want, and anyone else they're opposing, right? And there's so many different divisions and things happening in the world that does not lead to a lifestyle of peace. Anxiety is at an all-time high, right? And like there's such a thing of like, okay, if you're not willing to live life that is agreeable with me, then I'll cut you off. So the idea of unity is not really being spread around, These are very countercultural to how Jesus is calling us to live. And so the way and the path to life, it's narrow and it's hard. And we have to deny ourselves and deny our own desires and what we want and what feels good and what we think life should be and how we expect our life with Jesus to look like. Sometimes it doesn't look that way, and so we have to readjust. And we have to say, okay, God, like I still surrender and I still submit. And even though this isn't what I had planned, and even though this isn't what I want, I surrender to you and I deny myself. I'm going to take up my cross. I'm going to follow you wherever you lead me, wherever you guide me. So when you start saying something to me that really lines up with what I thought my life with Christ would look like, I have to readjust and I have to say, I submit, I surrender. I know it won't be easy, but I want to be those faithful few that have found this path to life. I want to be the faithful few that walk in your way, that walk according to how you've called me to walk. I think as we continue on our journey with Christ, whatever that looks like for you, it's important to remember when you get into these phases where you don't agree necessarily or you're not sure, and it just seems too hard to keep going, we must deny ourselves. We must remember that the gate is narrow, the way is hard, and those that find it are few. And we have to decide, do we want to be those faithful few, or do we want to go on the way and through the gate that is wide and it's easy, but it leads to destruction? You can always do the easy thing But what do you gain from that? Does it make your life easier? Or later down the road, does it just lead to destruction and chaos? Like when you talk about things just in such contrast like this, it can seem kind of harsh or it could seem kind of hard, but it's honest and it's true. And it's something to consider when you're going to follow Christ. But again, when we look at the track record, if you've been a believer for a while, it's always better Christ's way, Jesus' way. It's always better than our own way. It's always better to do what Jesus has asked of us versus what we've planned to live for ourselves. And so my prayer for anyone that is a believer in Jesus Christ or anyone wanting to believe is that they would continually be submitted to Christ, that they would continually be submitted to walking according to his ways and his guiding and his leading, that they would be okay reconsidering how they thought life would look and what they thought things would be. And honestly, I shouldn't say they, I should say we, because I still do it. I still think sometimes that life is going to look a certain way, or that I can have what I want and what Jesus wants from me. And sometimes that's not the case. A lot of times that's not the case. Like, my purpose is to do what Jesus has asked me to do and not just do what I want to do. And sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's easy. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't even want to try my way. What I was thinking wouldn't even make sense. And then sometimes I'm like, ooh, this is hard. Following Jesus can be hard and it's uncomfortable. And like, what are people going to say about me and what are people going to think? But I'd rather take the hard way and be found amongst the faithful few. And so my prayer is that we would walk as the faithful few, denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following Jesus wherever he leads. Thank you for listening. That concludes this episode of Join the Morning podcast. Our next episode will be Friday, June 28th, and we'll have a guest that talks about their faith journey and what led them to where they are now in trusting Jesus. Please remember to follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and remember to follow on Instagram at Join the Morning Pod for updates. See you in the next episode.
Yeah.